So thank you again for joining us. The BERDO Review Board does not have an appointed board chair. So in the meantime, I will lead us in a vote for acting chair. Does anyone want to make a nomination for acting chair today? Any of the board members?
I nominate Lee Matsueda.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do I have a second?
Second.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I will do a vote roll call style. Board member Boyd, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. Board member Ellis.
In favor.
Board member is Jacobs with us. Board member Jacobs. I don't think she's joined yet. Counselor Lara.
In favor.
Great. Board member Lattimore.
In favor.
Board member Matsueda.
In favor.
Board member Nelson.
In favor.
Board member O'Malley.
Aye.
And board member Palmer Dunning.
In favor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. I will now hand over the meeting to acting chair Matsueda.
All right. Thanks, Diana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call this public hearing to order at 4:36 p.m. In accordance with the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance regulations adopted pursuant to the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, Boston City Code Ordinances Section 7-2.2. The BERDO Review Board will hold a virtual public hearing at 4:30 on August 7th to review the following topics in regards to the reduction of greenhouse gases from building energy production and consumption so as to promote the public health and welfare of Boston residents. In accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we are conducting this public meeting online. To ensure public access to deliberations of the BERDO Review Board, the public may access this call through telephone and video conferencing. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment on regulation discussions. And to do so, you just we ask that you please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. And if you're calling in and you cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. You can also send your questions to staff via email. And that email has changed now. It's berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. So we got a full house today, full board, which is great. Welcome to Board Member Ellis. For the record, I am Lee Matsueda, acting chair of the board. I'm going to now conduct a roll call of board members. So board members, just please say your name in the order that they appear on the slide. Thank you.
Rashida Boyd.
Stephen Ellis.
I think board member Jacobs might be joining us late.
Kendra Lara. Gail Lattimore.
Lee Matsueda.
Jack Nelson.
Matt O'Malley.
Kai Palmer Dunning.
Okay, great. And now we'll have the staff introduce themselves.
Diana Vasquez, Environment Department.
Hi, everyone. Claudia Diaz Martinez, Environment Department.
Ladine Joroff, Environment Department.
Fantastic. So on this next slide, you're going to see our agenda for today's meeting. We're going to start with, as we usually do, the approval of our meeting minutes. And then we'll kind of review activities that have been completed in phase 3 of the regulations development so far. And the Environment Department will introduce Hardship Compliance Plans and the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. And then we'll revisit building portfolios and the individual compliance schedules and propose next steps. And then, as we usually do, we'll also end with some administrative updates. So for our first item, we're gonna just approve our last meeting minutes. Board members, I'm gonna ask, is there someone to raise a motion to approve?
Motion.
So moved.
Approval of the meeting minutes.
Thank you, Council Lara. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. I guess we'll just do it this way. All in favor, just say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstain?
I abstain. I wasn't part of it.
I'll make a note of that. That's right. Great. So it looks like that measure has passed, and we'll make sure that that shows up on the website so everyone gets access to our meeting minutes. Great, thank you. We're going to move on to our second agenda item here. We're going to get some updates and have some discussion on the BERDO Phase 3 regulations. And so I'm going to pass it over to our Environment Department staff to help us out.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, trying to unmute. I can kick us off. So just as a reminder, we're in phase 3 of regulations development, and here are the topics we're hoping to address. So building portfolios and individual compliance schedules, hardship compliance plans, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, fines and enforcement, and compliance with emission standards. So phase 3 progress and activities thus far. We've launched phase 3 in March, and we've had 2 public technical working sessions on building portfolios and individual compliance schedules in March and April. The slide decks and notes for these meetings are available on the boston.gov BERDO regulations website. We're holding our monthly community advisory group meetings. Our next one is actually tomorrow. So these are monthly meetings that we meet with our community advisory group. We've had focus groups on hardship compliance plans with the following stakeholders: affordable housing, Longwood hospitals, healthcare institutions, historic preservation, and the Green Ribbon Commission's cultural institutions working group. And we are working with a technical consultant named Bureau Happold to support the development of regulations regarding technical hardship compliance plans. And then we're planning additional community meetings, a virtual town hall, technical working sessions, and focus groups as they come up for the summer. And then just as a reminder, there is currently an open comment period right now, and it closes on this Friday at 12 p.m. So we are accepting any comments regarding building portfolios and the individual compliance schedules. And I should say, by we, I mean the Air Pollution Control Commission. And then the next Air Pollution Control Commission meeting is August 16th, so next week, where the BERDO team will take back all those comments and present revised language to the APCC. And at its discretion, the APCC may open a second formal public comment period for 21 days or vote to approve the regulations. And now I will hand it off to Claudia.
Hi, everyone. I will provide an introduction to both Hardship Compliance Plans and Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. These are our next topics of the phase 3 regulations that we will be addressing. So this is just an introduction to those to get acquainted with the requirements set in the ordinance, and then talk about certain opportunities that these regulations will present to address community concerns and environmental justice benefits. Next slide, please. So first, hardship compliance plans. You will find them in the slides as HCP. But hardship compliance plans are a flexibility mechanism that allows building owners to receive alternative emissions reduction targets and or timelines for compliance. This means that this is an optional flexibility alternative that is available for building owners. They need to apply to receive this. And this could provide them with either different targets that are set in the ordinance. So it could allow building owners to have perhaps higher emissions than the ones that are allowed for their normal building type, or to have a different reduction schedule. So at a different pace than the one that is set by the ordinance. These hardship compliance plans are available for buildings that experience a hardship in complying with BERDO. The ordinance already lists some of the circumstances that might be eligible for hardship, including historic building designations, affordable housing refinancing timelines, pre-existing long-term energy contracts without reopeners, financial hardship, and any other factors detailed in the upcoming regulations. This means that during this regulations phase, we could detail additional circumstances or building characteristics that could be eligible for hardship. And hardship compliance plans are approved by the BERDO Review Board, and the Review Board may set conditions of approval for these plans. So all of the things I mentioned are requirements that are set in the ordinance and cannot be changed at this point, but the regulations that we are currently in the process of will clarify, like I mentioned, additional circumstances that should be eligible for hardships, the application and review process, and the conditions of approval that might be set by the review board. And this is where, as Diana mentioned before, we are currently working excuse me, with a technical consultant team from Bureau Happold to inform regulations related to technical hardships. Next slide, please. The next topic is the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. This Equitable Emissions Investment Fund is a new fund that will collect all alternative compliance payments and penalties made to BERDO, and those will be invested in local building carbon abatement projects. Just for reference, alternative compliance payments are one of the compliance options that are available for building owners. So if a building owner is above their emission standard and has more emissions than what they are allowed to, they could pay for the equivalent of those tons of emissions that they're over the emission standard. So all that money will be collected in this fund, as well as any fines and other types of penalties. The ordinance sets that the fund shall prioritize projects that benefit environmental justice communities, and the review board is responsible for evaluating project proposals, making expenditure recommendations, and setting conditions for expenditures. So the process for these is simplified in the diagram you see on the right on this slide. So any BERDO buildings with emissions that are over their limits will pay the ACPs and or penalties to comply with BERDO. That money will be collected into the fund, and then those ACPs and penalties will be invested in local carbon reduction projects that are approved by the review board. Again, all of these things I have mentioned are set in the ordinance and cannot be changed, but the regulations can clarify things like who is eligible to apply for this fund, what is the application process, the review process, so how the review board will select these projects, as well as the conditions for expenditure that the review board may be able to select. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to present certain opportunities that we have to address and prioritize benefits to environmental justice communities through the regulations related to hardship compliance plans and the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. So the first avenue that we have are related to the conditions that the review board can set for hardship compliance plans. So what happens with this flexibility mechanism is that the owner will apply for hardship. This will give them flexibility, and during the application, the owner may propose alternative strategies for advancing environmental justice benefits and the goals of BERDO. The review board will then review that application. Let's say that they grant flexibility, and then they can set conditions of approval that are related to said environmental justice benefits and to promote the goals of BERDO. And the owner must then meet those conditions to receive and maintain their hardship compliance plan. So some examples of the potential types of conditions or environmental justice benefits that owners could consider and the review board could also consider at the moment of applying conditions could be related to, for example, prioritizing hiring of local, cooperative, and minority and women-owned businesses, enterprises, rent stabilization or other anti-displacement measures if applicable, energy burden reduction or energy cost and benefit sharing, tenant disclosures related to compliance with BERDO, as well as other conditions that might be specified in this regulations process. Next slide, please. The second avenue to address environmental justice, community benefits, and other community concerns are related to the projects that will get funded through the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. Like I mentioned, the ordinance already says that the expenditures from the fund shall prioritize environmental justice populations, but depending on how the reviewer assesses and selects those projects, we have the opportunity to also give importance and attention to other community issues. So through this process, the owner will apply for funding from the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. The reviewer will then review those project proposals, score them according to a set of criteria, and then may set conditions for expenditure. And some examples of those potential types of evaluation criteria could be the scale and timing of potential emissions reductions. Like I mentioned before, all of the projects related to the fund need to have an emissions reduction component, but the reviewer could consider, for example, how many emissions the project is expected to reduce and when comparing different proposals. You could also consider benefits to affordable housing, inclusion of tenant protections and anti-displacement strategies, improvements to outdoor air quality, improvements to indoor air quality and tenants' health, inclusion of living wage standards, hiring of local, cooperative, and minority and women-owned business enterprises for building improvements, as well as other benefits to environmental justice populations. Again, these are sort of categories or types of conditions that we could consider as we go through the regulations process, and we definitely are expecting feedback from the review board and from residents on more specifics on these conditions. And then on these evaluation criteria, sorry. And then during a public hearing, when these proposals are being considered, then the reviewer could also discuss conditions for expenditure that are related to the same topics or concerns. Next slide, please. And at this moment, we don't have any specific regulations proposals or language to present to you, but I want to give you a timeline of when we expect to have more information on this. So for hardship compliance plans, we will present preliminary regulations proposals to the Air Pollution Control Commission next week at the August 16 public hearing. We will also be conducting a public technical working session on August 22nd from 1 to 2:30 p.m. and I will put the links on the chat in a second. And at this public technical working session, or technical consultant team from Bureau Happel will be present. And the current goal is then to present draft regulations to the APCC at the September 13 public hearing. For the fund, it's a very similar process. We will present preliminary proposals to the APCC on August 16. We will conduct a different public working session on August 23rd from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And the goal is also to present draft regulations to the APCC on the September 13 public hearing. And I'll send the links for those events on the chat right now, just for everyone in the public. And I think that's all for this section on my side.
Okay, thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing that. Yeah, and so it looks like we won't have another board meeting until after these are presented to the APCC, correct? Okay, so this is kind of an important place where, at least at this moment, I mean, we'll have other opportunities, but this is an important place for board members. If you have specific ideas or recommendations or suggestions around those regulations, we do our best to speak to those now. We will not have another meeting before those draft regulations are presented. Okay, so I think we're at the phase now, as the slide suggests, where we're going to go ahead and just invite board members, and then we will have public comments as well on this. But let's start with the board to see what sort of questions you all have or comments, and we'll just go down the list here. So board member Boyd.
I have a comment, but I just need a second, so I'll wait.
Of course, we'll come back.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Ellis.
Yes, thank you, Chair Messlida. My first question for the department, I'm thinking about sort of trying to navigate back to it. On the hardship compliance plan, excuse me, the section states that, the owners will receive, thank you for pulling it up, but I'm going a little bit further back. The owners will receive an alternate emission reduction targets and or timeline for compliance. I just wanted to clarify or seek some clarifications about the target goals with respects to how an owner can achieve this. And I'm not sure if it's a part of the ordinance itself or part of the regulation, but there's an aspect that requires that owners show a linear or better reductions in their emissions over time. And so I just wanted, for the record, to get it cleared if that would also allow an owner to sort of go around that or not be subjected to that linear or better emissions reduction.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that requirement of having a linear or better emissions reduction is specific to the individual compliance schedule, which is another flexibility mechanism. So, of course, this will be determined in regulations, but one of the possibilities for hardship could be something similar to an individual compliance schedules, but perhaps without those requirements of 50% reduction by 2030. Or the linear or better emissions reduction. So that is a possibility on having a different timeline without the restrictions of the ICS.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. One second question that I have, and this might be combining two different parts with respects to the environmental justice reporting requirements that are showing up within the regulation for pathway 2 and 3. There's an aspect that you're requiring owners to provide a narrative about the plans to prioritize their sort of distributions and work within EJ community. I'm wondering how, if it is at all possible for our board to be able to, utilize those suggestions to come up with potential plans or come up with potential pathways for us to utilize the funds from the Equitable Emission Funds. And I hopefully my question is getting clear for you, but it's most likely what I'm thinking about is not just having folks submit applications for considerations to be paid or funded by the Equitable Emission Fund, but also for us to take into account what owners are saying that they might do in those communities, and maybe we can potentially discuss those being funding opportunities. Is that an opportunity?
That's a good question. So is your question if the review board could proactively reach out to an owner and offer funding, or just if the review board can consider other documentation from the owner from building portfolios or ICS as part of the application?
The latter, but the former also sounds interesting as well, but more so the latter.
So if I can jump in, I think, so the proposal we're going to put forth on August 16th won't be probably draft language. It's going to be strawman proposals. And so there will be an informal comment period where we'd appreciate more feedback on the suggestions. But a question would be, yes, like, should the applications for use of the funds be, for the public to apply, or would the review board issue like RFPs that might be targeted at certain issues or neighborhoods that could vary from RFP to RFP? So we're very open to suggestions on what that would look like. And as I said, we'll try and put a proposal that invites feedback around those questions.
Okay, thank you. That's all for me for right now. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Board Member Ellis. Is Board Member Jacobs with us? I don't think I see her on this list. I think we'll keep rolling then. Councilor Lara.
Sorry, trying to unmute. So we just recently had our training and onboarding with Diana, and I asked a lot of questions, a lot of very detailed questions about all of this, and so I don't have any additional questions right now.
Thank you. Board Member Lattimore.
Yes, thank you. I just want to go back to what Board Member Ellis was asking and make sure I understand. So with a hardship compliance plan, that means that you do not necessarily, the board could set a different time frame altogether, meaning it doesn't have to, the building doesn't have to meet the 2030, 2050 timeframes for emissions reductions. Is that the case? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Uh-huh, okay. And that is kind of out there indefinitely, or is that, you know, at some point, the idea is that the building will come into compliance, or it could be that indefinitely that property might never come into compliance? Is that a possibility for a specific property, for example, with the hardship compliance plan?
I think that's something that it would be great to get feedback on whether, you know, hardship compliance plans should be on different timeframes. Like maybe there's some temporary hardship compliance plans, maybe there should be permanent, maybe there should be the option to have different types. So that's something that would be definitely good to have feedback on.
Okay, thank you. And then I just have a question about Euro Happold. Can you say a little bit more about that entity and what other work they've done, if any, for the city similar to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm not the best qualified to speak on all their experience. I feel I would do a disservice, but they will be present at the technical working session on hardship compliance plans, and I assume they will present all their whole experience and what they have been working on. But so far, in terms of BERDO, we're working with them to be able to identify our possible technical hardships that building owners might face in complying with BERDO, and looking at different ways in which the reviewer can assess those hardships and build hardship compliance plans from the technical perspective.
So so that means participating in one of those sessions to understand more about. Are they working in any other part of the city in a similar way in terms of regulations and review of certain things, or is this the city's first time working with them?
Oh, they do have a lot of experience working with buildings and decarbonization projects in Boston. I'm unaware if they're working in other projects at the moment with the city, but they definitely demonstrated experience with that.
And just for the record, they were selected through an RFP process, through the procurement process, but we can look into what other projects they may have done with the city. We just don't know offhand.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions right now.
Thanks, Board Member Lattimore. I had a similar question about Euro Happold and started to look at them online, and it seems like they have a bunch of experience in this area, but yeah, curious to know a little bit more. I think one of the questions I had is just a clarifying question or something I'm not familiar with the term. It's regarding the hardship compliance plans, and in the ordinance, it talks about them being available for, among the list, something that says pre-existing long-term energy contracts without reopeners. Can someone just explain to me what that means?
It is literally like a contract that has a long term, so perhaps like 20 or more years for energy, that by meaning no reopener, meaning there's no chance to renegotiate kind of the price or the sourcing of the energy. So that's what we mean there.
Mentality. And then to speak to the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, I think I am particularly interested about like who's eligible. And I guess to be clear, when we talk about owners, we are talking about this obviously being targeted to the owners that are owners of buildings or building portfolios that sort of fit our criteria currently, correct?
So I think that's another area, that we're open for feedback, which is, yes, who should be eligible to receive the funds?
Okay.
Should it be a BERDO building owner? Should it be open to any building owner or resident in the city? So that's definitely a place where we'll seek input, and that what would be the decision criteria. That might be one factor, or it could be a qualifying factor.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful, because I'm thinking of projects that might not fit quite that 20,000 square foot threshold, and but that have a lot of benefits, and I think could be considered really good investments that line up with a lot of how I think different stakeholders articulated, this is an important use of this fund. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited to kind of talk more specifically about how to open that up and make sure, obviously we should be specific, but
Well,
appreciate it.
I'll just flag a place where we'd appreciate feedback would be, yes, when we're thinking about who can apply and how to select projects, does the review board want kind of bright line tests or standards? And these evaluation criteria that Claudia displayed and walked through, those are examples of ways that we could use the review board could use to review applications. So if you think there are others that should be included, we'd be, open to those as well.
Great. Those are the ones on slide 15 here. Okay. Yep. Great.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
just wanted to clarify that the main limitation in the ordinance is that the funds need to be used for local building carbon abatement projects. So there's an emissions reduction component and there's a local component.
Thank you. I will pass it on to board member Nelson.
Thank you. I imagine there'll be a high demand for a lot of applications for funds to help fund these energy conservation and decarbonization projects. I know this might be difficult to predict, but those funds are all through collection of compliance payments. Do we have any sense of the balance between what the volume of compliance payments will be versus the need for funds to drive these projects?
That's a good question. I wanted to also add that City Council did provide some seed funding for the fund already. At the moment, we don't have an estimate of exactly how much money will come into the fund after 2025, but it's certainly something we can come back to in the future.
So the seed money that you mentioned, who provided that?
City Council.
Oh, okay.
And
Oh, go ahead.
I would just flag that we're also going to try and continue to just help direct, other funding, federal, state funding as it becomes available to buildings that are subject to BERDO, recognizing that, this equitable fund, I think, it will not be the only source of financial assistance. Yeah.
So I imagine there's going to be competing projects looking for the same funds. Is the board going to have to compare project to project because there's limited funds?
That is a possibility. And I think that's why we want to try to set up some, evaluation criteria. And if the board wants flexibility of kind of directing what types of projects it might look for in a particular cycle, again, that doesn't have to be an option, but we're open to feedback of what you think would make that process work well and what the public thinks.
Right.
Yep.
So we could be looking at, dollars as compared to how many tons of carbon dioxide is reduced by project. We may be required to look at things in that way. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Board Member Nelson. And just to be clear, I thought the number was 20 million. Is that accurate? The seed money from the city, how much is it? Do we know? Okay.
Sorry, I believe it's not 20 million. I think it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I think
Yeah,
the
half
20
million is what I think I heard when we were in our orientation.
Okay,
I think the 20 million you're thinking about is the ARPA funds that went to affordable housing.
I'm completely, yes, I'm completely mistaking it. Thank you. That is a major difference. Okay, so let's keep it moving then. Board Member O'Malley.
Okay, so thank you, folks, and thank you again to the team. This is such a thorough overview. These two items we're discussing today, in my opinion, are the most important things that we as a board will do. So when you talk about drafting language or however you phrased it for the APCC next month, or excuse me, next week, I would just add that there is extreme flexibility for this board. First, on the hardship compliance, as Board Member Lattimore said, this is something that we should have strict oversight on, and it also should be rare, recognizing the fact that there are going to have to be some hardship compliance pieces that we accommodate. But one thing I think we need to be crystal clear on is that it's a very bespoke process. Any precedents, it'll be up to the board to decide. I don't want one 30,000 square foot building to get some hardship compliance and then building across the street to assume that they would then fall in. I think it's vital that the board is able to make that determination for the hardship compliance. And then the Equitable Investment Fund, to Board Member Nelson's point, I remember at a hearing on this, Commissioner Breezius said, not lightheartedly, that we hope we generate no revenue for this because everyone's in compliance. That's obviously not going to be the case, but there will be scarce dollars for this. I'm delighted to hear that there could be other avenues for revenue so that we're able to do more. But I want to make sure the way we wrote this, and I think it's very, very important for this board to maximize the control and flexibility. Of course, there should be guidelines. Of course, this is a partnership with the city and the environment department to make sure that we're all on the same page. And obviously, the mayor is our quarterback here. But I think it's very, very vital as you all draft language to share with the APCC, which we will then vote on, that it allows us as a board to have that flexibility to both determine what constitutes a hardship and make sure that as I said, it's a very bespoke process for individual buildings. And also with the investment fund, we wrote it crystal clear that it has to prioritize, and it should prioritize EJ communities, but we also want to make sure that this board is able to work with the neighbors, work with the community, work with the city to fund worthwhile goals. So not so much a question as more of a statement as you folks are drafting language for the APCC next week.
Thank you, Board Member O'Malley. Board Member Palmer Dunning.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is a great overview. I look forward to continuing the conversation to figure out these regulations. I kind of have three questions. The technical working sessions on the 22nd and 23rd, will board members have the ability to participate in those working sessions to help determine regulations, or is this kind of our venue to do that?
Since they're all public sessions, so anyone is free to attend, but we expect to also come back to the review board once we have proposals and draft language. So that would definitely not be the only opportunity that there is to engage with hardship or the fund.
Great. And then my second question is on the hardship compliance plan. So for owners, it says that they can propose some strategies and then the review board can set conditions. Will there be kind of a suite of strategies, conditions that building owners and the review board can kind of pull from, or will these strategies and conditions be considered on like a building by building or portfolio by portfolio basis, just so that there's kind of parity to Board Member O'Malley's point? We don't want certain strategies or conditions to be applied to one building, their assumption that those conditions and strategies could be used for another.
Yeah, so I think the plan would be that, yes, each application would have to show characteristics, relevant to its own building or building portfolio. And then similarly for conditions, that again will probably be unique. I think the goal in the regulations is to provide an outline of the types of conditions that the review board can think about. We're very open to the feedback that we're already starting to hear about not making that an exhaustive list, but to provide some guidance for building owners of what they should be thinking about as well.
and tying it to what the ordinance does say about focusing on work in environmental justice communities, and then the general kind of purposes of the ordinance, which calls out other goals as well, around affordable housing, public health, and just kind of highlighting those for people to be thinking about.
Okay. And then my final question is on the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. So as we kind of shared, there'll be kind of initial seed funding, but the fund will get its funding from alternative compliance payments, which at this point we don't have like a good sense of how much that will be. So I'm curious about, in order to kind of keep the fund sustainable, ensure that the funding can be used over the long-term rollout and will BERDO, will there be any considerations around repayment? For instance, if I'm assuming the fund the importance of the fund is to kind of cover the upfront costs of emissions reduction strategies that communities and projects can use. So say that like a building wants to implement a ground source heat pump to reduce its emissions, that has a 5-year payback, 5-10-year payback. Will there be any expectation for that funding to be repaid in terms of savings or other types of things, in order to kind of make sure that, in addition to the alternative compliance payments that are being made, that there is some level of sustainability to the fund outside of that?
So that is another area where we're going to be specifically soliciting feedback and comments from the public and from you all as well. Because yes, there are different models, right, of a grant versus low interest or no interest loan, what a repayment schedule could look like. So we welcome feedback on what people think the range of options should be.
Okay, and that's all of my questions.
Great. Thanks, Board Member Palmer Dunning. How about you, Board Member Boyd? Let's come back to you and see if there's anything you'd like to add, comments or questions.
I'm just always concerned about the tenant and making sure the tenant is not going to get evicted, or the landlord is not going to make the tenant pay extra after the work is done. Like, I'm really concerned about that. I just want to make sure. I know everything else is very important as well, but I don't want any tenants to be mishoused or harassed or anything while this is happening. So that's really what I focus on. It's the tenant. I'm more worried about the tenant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just do one last round. If there are any just other quick comments, I won't go down the list, but if there are any other just comments or questions from members of the board, and then I would like to make sure we get to members of the public. I see Board Member Lattimore.
Yeah, to Board Member Boyd's point and other people's point, I wondered, and I think I asked this at the last question, and we'll do a one-on-one also with Diana on it, but wondered about, what is really possible for the board when we're considering, legally and otherwise, when we're considering hardship compliance plans, when we're considering equitable emissions fund, payments. I think it would just be helpful to understand, are there any kind of legal, or I wouldn't say ethical, but I'll just use that word, issues that we need to pay attention to, legal issues in particular. I could just think about wanting to require certain things that other people may not think should be required. So I just wondered, like, what kind of, I know we have a framework to some extent as listed on the slides, but I think it would be helpful for us to get some additional read on like the things that come up in the comments, as well as things that board members think might be necessary to, or good to consider. So just some type of read, legal or otherwise, I think would be helpful as we go through and look at these, the suggestions and the regulations, the proposed regulations. So that's one comment. The other thing I would say is, like, for example, Now I'm just going to give a quick example of like, do we have a right to ask if someone is applying for either a hardship compliance or a application to the Equitable Emissions Fund? Do we have the right to ask for their financial status? What's within our purview and to be able to ask. And then the other thing is, there was a question about, what the long-term gas and other utility contracts might look like. As an affordable housing developer, I understand that issue because we do have bulk gas contracts that are for a length of time. And so I'm all for trying to transition off of gas, but that's an issue. I just wondered if there's any data, which I doubt there is, but any data out there that speaks to the number of buildings that might have in the BERDO, that are BERDO eligible, that might have those type of contracts, just trying to get a sense. And then my final question, so that's one question. The final question is, with the Equitable Emissions Fund, are there other, as we just had a Green New Deal, Boston Green New Deal Coalition meeting with City of Boston cabinet members. And I know that there's a dashboard now that the Green New Deal has created related to the various funding opportunities that the city is going after, IRA and otherwise. And just wondered if that Equitable Emissions Fund is being thought of, or is there any resources through the IRA or other federal monies that could be used to seed the Equitable Emissions Fund? So the questions are, do we have the ability to kind of get some legal read on, once these proposed regulations come into play, our own thoughts about what we might require when people are coming for hardship compliance plans, as well as use of the Equitable Emissions Fund, and how many properties do you know have any long-term gas contracts or other types of contracts that would, chokehold them a bit? And then, what else are we thinking about besides the alternative compliance payments, if anything, to seed the Equitable Emissions Fund?
Yeah, so that's a lot of great questions. I'm going to start with the easier one to answer, which is about the long-term contracts. And no, as you suspected, we don't have data on that. That's something that people would have to self-report and demonstrate for us. I'm going to do them in reverse order. So on the funding sources, looking at funds, from the federal programs, from state programs, other places, I think it will be an interesting discussion about whether that's put directly into the Equitable Investment Fund, or if we do what we've been doing before, which is using it kind of outside of the fund to support buildings, many of which are subject to BERDO. The goal is to definitely provide funding from as many sources as we can to help buildings that are subject to the requirements. Interesting question about whether we use some of it directly into the fund for the review board to then distribute. So that's something for us, I think, to consider. And then on your broader question about, what can we do? There are obviously like some limitations. As a city, we have a lot of authority, but we are subject to the realm of state law as well. I think it might make sense to come back to this point when we can look into some of the questions a bit more, but I would flag there's a few things. One is here we have a little more leeway because these are incentives that we are giving, right? A hardship compliance plan and use of the fund money. So you're putting a condition on something that people are asking for. It's not a requirement, but there's still some limits on what we can do. We'd also want to think about any requirement we put on. How do we enforce it? How do we assess whether it's being complied with and can enforce it? So we want to make sure we have the tools for the information up front, but the long-term compliance kind of observation and enforcement. And then another piece that we'll look into is, when people do share information with the city, it generally becomes a public record. So we would just want to think about what that means. If we're asking what type of information we'd be asking people to share, are we comfortable with the possibility that that could become available to anybody, and whether there are any exceptions to that? So I think you raised a lot of good points that maybe we can come back to discuss in more detail.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Any last questions or comments from the board? Okay. Hearing none, I'm gonna now open the meeting to public comment. So As a reminder to members of the public, to provide public comment, you can raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. And if you're calling in and you can't use that, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. You can also send your questions to staff via email, and it's BERDO Review Board altogether at boston.gov. And so we have time for everyone. We're gonna just ask people to try to limit your comments and questions to 3 minutes. And please be sure to introduce yourself and what neighborhood you live in or work in. Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and open it up and give you all a chance in the public. For those who'd like to provide comments and ask questions, we're gonna open it up right now. Wheezy, please.
Hi, thank you. Wheezy Waldstein, Action for Equity. My experience with the city with fees, with penalties being paid has been with the Boston Residents Jobs Policy, where literally for decades, no one had to pay in. They were either not assessed or there were excuses, or now there's a challenge. So I would be interested over time, not today, to the consideration of, is this actually going to be a viable source of funds? And what complicates it in my mind, and I'm sort of raising it as an issue, but not thinking this time to either discuss it, and I'll go to some of the other sessions, is that the penalty can be for deterrence in order to get people to comply, or it can be, here's the penalty, and we're going to raise money to do what we need done based on those penalties. Those really have very different purposes. And given that the city has historically not shown a willingness with the Boston Residents Jobs Policy to assess any penalties, it's really, I guess I think it's worth the board thinking really hard about coupling this. Here we have this fund, how do we use it? Here we have these penalties, and really just decoupling them and treating them as having separate intents, separate needs. So I just wanted to flag that city experience because it seems relevant to thinking through how better to set up this one.
Yeah, really appreciate you sharing that, Wheezy. Thank you for that. Other members of the public, would you like to make a comment or ask any questions? Yeah, I'll give it a little bit more time. Any other questions or comments on this before we move on? Okay. Great. So I think I will just open it up one last time to any other members of the board. Do you all just have any last discussion or questions you want to offer? And then if not, we're gonna switch gears.
No.
Okay, I do see a comment in the chat here with maybe a question as well. Unless that person would like to come off of mute, we can also read it, but would you like to read that or aloud? Okay, I'll just go ahead and read it so we can see it here. For those who can't see the chat, it says, from an environmental justice perspective, there are issues of urban heat islands that cause heat strokes, peak demand stresses on the grid, risking blackouts, marginal emissions that cause asthma, heart problems, etc. Can there be consideration of addressing these issues in funding? Also, can you describe the role of RECs and additionality amid this funding capability?
I can start. Oh, or Aladdin, you can start. Sorry. So I assume they're asking in reference to the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. As I mentioned before, there needs to be an emissions reduction component to projects that are funded through the fund, but we can go through regulations and add certain considerations that the reviewer may consider in addition to emissions reduction. So for example, components of climate resilience or the urban heat island, for example, if the location of a project is in an urban heat island or something like that, that is certainly something that we could consider and are welcome to feedback on whether and how issues of heat resilience should be considered as part of the criteria for the review board. The second question, I'm not sure if they're asking just about the separate compliance pathway that it's buying regs, but that's a separate issue to the fund. So maybe if the person wants to clarify their question. Buying regs in complying can impact the fund. So buying regs is definitely a compliance pathway that is available to building owners. So building owners could definitely come into compliance by buying regs or reducing emissions or entering into CCE rather than paying into the fund. So that is correct. I'm not sure if I addressed the question.
Thanks, Claudia. And thanks for your question. All right. Any last comments or questions?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment.
Please.
To Weezy's point, kind of about decoupling the penalty and access to the fund. I think that I think the goal is for all the buildings in BERDO to be in compliance and not have to face a penalty and pay into the fund. But I do also think there is a real value in having this fund because of our capacity to decide how funding is used, as well as the flexibility for how it can be used. So I really do think that in addition to being a penalty assessed for buildings that are out of compliance, I think there does need to also be some sort of incentive to get money into the fund, because I think that the people or properties and owners that we'd want to be using this funding that would need this funding most might have difficulty applying for federal and state funding to do the similar projects. So I think this funding, this fund allows an easier way for them to get funding to do those types of things than applying for a federal state grant. So I do. So while I think all buildings should be in compliance with BERDO and shouldn't pay and shouldn't have to pay a penalty because they're in compliance, this fund still needs to be funded so that property owners can use it.
Thank you, Board Member Paul Dunning. Board Member O'Malley.
Thank you. Just very briefly, wanted to follow up on the question in the chat because I think it's an excellent one. And just, so folks watching are clear, if you look at section F of the ordinance, which talks about the Equitable Investment Fund, and of course it talks about using funds to support carbon abatement projects, but then there's about 6 or 8 bullet points, and it specifically calls out local air quality improvement as well as reduced energy burdens. And then the last bullet point says any further environmental additions. So I would argue, I think most people would agree, growing a tree canopy, planting more trees could be considered a carbon abatement project. But again, it underscores my earlier point that allowing flexibility for this board and for the city as well, for the Environment Department as well, I think is crucial as we think about fine tuning what regulations and what guidelines look like, because there's no shortage of really worthwhile projects that we could be implementing. Some would be very costly, others would be less so. So it's finding that right balance. Thank you.
you. And it looks like Tiara has a follow-up in the chat here. Appreciates the points and just says, in your projections on the fund, do you believe rec availability will be lower to environmental justice funding? And what will the concept of additionality, which limits the availability of in recs, have in impacting the potential funds?
Yeah, so I think what this is getting at, this went to an earlier point of, we don't have projections on how many people utilize the alternative compliance payment versus using a compliance mechanism like buying recs. So we don't have kind of that analysis at this point. And for recs, the ordinance and the regulations do specify that buying recs do have to satisfy the class 1 eligibility requirements from the renewable portfolio standard that the state has. And then there are additionality requirements if you are using a power purchase agreement. So there are some requirements around that in the ordinance and regulations.
Thank you. Okay. If there are no other comments or questions, we are going to move on and kind of come back to building portfolios and individual compliance schedules, the topic of basically all of our board meetings up until now. As I think was stated earlier, you know, there is a comment period that is open regarding these topics. The APCC draft regulations are available online at boston.gov/BERDO-regulations. The Environment Department has highlighted some key topics from the regulations. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it to you, Diana. Or maybe not. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Acting Chair. Actually, these are just some topics that we pulled out, but I think if, you know, this can be kind of how board members would like to provide any feedback. Because in our last meeting, we talked about maybe wanting to collect feedback, maybe in a more formal, direct sense from the board members. So I don't know, Acting Chair, how you feel like would make the most sense. We could go topic by topic, or we can ask board members if there's something specific they would like to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, let's go with the second for now and just see of these topics, or are there some that are not listed here? Are there any in particular that board members would like to comment on, you know, have some discussion on in particular? And you know, so we'll start with that, and if we can identify some, that's great. And then if not, maybe we can just go down the list and see if there are any final, you know, additional comments. But yeah, board members, does this list look good? Are there any things missing that you want to make sure we get to? And again, this is that important time that I think some have asked for, to make sure that there's ability to have some discussion.
I'd say we could start with these for sure.
Okay. Well, let's do it. Let's just go maybe in order for now then, and then we can add on if as needed. So the first on this list is the application timeline, as the slide shows. I think we can see what the current proposals are for building portfolios and the individual compliance schedule. Are there some specific comments or questions regarding the timelines we've laid out?
I'm also happy to do a quick
Review,
if that would be helpful.
Yeah, if there are any changes from the last time, that would be helpful to know. Otherwise, yeah.
No changes from last time.
Mm-hmm.
So for application timelines with building portfolios, we wrote in the proposed regs that the review board would have 45 days to vote on pathway 1. We said 45 days because this would give at least 2 public meetings on our current schedules, or at least 1 public meeting if we ended up meeting monthly. For pathway 2, we said 60 days. And then for pathway 3, 90 days, because we thought pathway 3 could be a little bit more tricky if there was an individual compliance schedule application in addition. So we'd have to review some numbers. And so the proposal also with the individual compliance schedule is also 90 days for the review board to vote on any of these applications.
I'd say on the face of it, those timeframes look fine, except that it's hard to determine the volume, right? And how it's going to actually go. And the only thing I could think of is, it as a possible comparison, not an exact comparison, is the zoning board of appeals and how, because they have thousands of buildings, I assume, every year that they review and make decisions on. And if that's any, what their timeframes are, how does this compare with their timeframes? Even though it's a different issue, it's just kind of similar in the sense that it's a body that has to look at materials, make decisions in a somewhat timely manner, et cetera. So I don't have any issues with the timing. I just simply because it's unclear how this is all going to go volume wise.
I would also just flag as another model we've looked at is the Wetlands Conservation Commission for the city, because they also have a large volume of applications with a state requirement about how quickly they have to respond. We have suggested a little bit more time here than what they're subject to, but it is another comparison in terms of potential volume.
And how long has that commission been in play, and how are they managing their timeframes? Are they able to keep up, and how many people are on that body?
They are able to keep up. They are also a volunteer commission with a staff in the environment department to assist them. So it's a similar setup.
Okay, thank you.
If for some reason we're overwhelmed with any one of these pathways, is there some recourse or some possibility, or are these, if we go in with the current draft language, are these sort of set? We have to meet these 45, 60, 90 for each pathway?
Yep, it's a great question. So as currently drafted, this is the pathway that we would want to hold ourselves to. We have not specified what the outcome would be if the board couldn't meet the time frame, but there would be an expectation of meeting it. So we're welcome to feedback about, if we want, what kind of provisions we might want to include around that. I would say some committees use like a default that if a commission or board doesn't vote, that it's deemed an approval. We did not put that in, but there's also the possibility of, complaints coming if we don't meet the timeline. So.
And as a background for the review board members, sort of these proposals came after many comment letters, if you may remember, stating the desire to have some certainty on the timeline for these applications. So that's how these proposals came about as well.
Yeah, I think I'm comfortable with the timeline, and board member Ellis, I see your hand. Well, I'll just quickly say I'm comfortable with the timeline, and I think what's also been helpful, I think we've been doing at this current pace 2 meetings a month, and we had talked about going to 1, but I feel like we should always be willing to do more, especially if needed, right? So I would kind of err on that side of things and say let's hit this timeline. And then the board is going to have to adjust as needed. If that means 2 meetings, we do it. So it's kind of where I'm at. Board member Ellis.
I agree with you, Chair Masweda. The only thing that I would add is that I am suspecting or potentially expecting that pathway 1 should be something that was going to be something that we flow through easily. And I believe during our orientation process, it was mentioned to us that we could set a clause to say, if this isn't the type of application that comes through, we can essentially just say, just approve it. We're not really interested. So I just wanted to call that out, and I'll stop there.
Great. Any other just comments on the timeline?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I mean, I know that earlier we had the staff had discussed being able to kind of batch some of these applications, and I'm assuming that it'll be a lot harder to batch those that are coming through the hardship compliance strategy, but kind of giving the longer timeline for that makes sense. But I think as much as possible, being able to batch the applications so that we can get through them on a timely basis to meet the deadline. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's excellent feedback. And I am definitely hoping to help and kind of make sure I can make this as efficient and accessible to board members for sure.
Any last comments or questions from the board on the building portfolios application timeline regulation language? Okay, if not, we got a number of other ones here. On the next slide, obviously environmental justice reporting requirements. Is it helpful to do a quick review and then we can see if there are any additional comments or feedback on this? Would one of the staff just be willing to do a quick review for us?
Yeah, I'm happy to do a quick review.
Yes.
So currently in the current proposals, if your proposed portfolio, so as part of the application, you would identify which buildings you'd want on your portfolio. If it triggered sort of like this environmental justice reporting, we would require you to map each building in your proposed portfolio and any environmental justice criteria at the location of each building. And those criteria are based on the Massachusetts state-based environmental justice criteria. We would then ask you to highlight any on-site campus district energy systems, any industrial or manufacturing buildings, any energy power stations, buildings located in EJ populations, and any residential buildings located in EJ populations. Based on your proposed portfolio, we would also ask you to highlight any deed restricted residential buildings in your portfolio, highlight any residential buildings in EJ populations. Oh, I think I said that one already, sorry. And then also provide maps that overlay asthma rates, the air toxic respiratory hazard index, and heat resilience metrics. We would source the data, so it would be from the EPA or the city of Boston, and then create an initial and updated emissions standard compliance plan. So we would ask for a narrative description of plans to prioritize distribution of benefits. And then 2 years later, we would ask for an emission standard compliance plan. Hopefully that was clear. I know it's a lot.
Thanks for that, Diana. Yeah, board member Palmer Dunning, did you want to say come off mute?
Yeah, well, based off the Mass EJ criteria, most of Boston falls under. So could that just be a basic requirement to provide the detail?
I can address that. So it's not in this slide, I think, but in the draft language, this is part of pathway 2, and that is for building portfolios that are, it is in the, no, it's not in the slide, sorry, that have buildings that produce local emissions, so power plants, industrial and manufacturing buildings, district energy systems, and so on, or that have a combination of affordable housing and market rate housing, or a combination of housing in EJ and non-EJ populations. So the goal of that was to sort of capture those portfolios that can either produce high emissions in a certain location, or that could have the potential of having disparities in investments between EJ and non-EJ populations and affordable versus non-affordable housing. So that was an effort to also specify even more who would go through this pathway. Because as you mentioned, like 80% of Boston is EJ.
Great, thank you.
Board member Ellis.
Thank you. Bear with me a bit because I have a comment and two questions. So my first comment is going back to the Equitable Emissions Fund. This was section 6B is what I was referring to when I was talking about projects that could be considered. And so perhaps I have a suggestion that, the narrative that is provided by a owner might be something that the city can extract for potential projects that the review board could consider. So that's where I sort of saw this as an opportunity where we may miss an opportunity to get additional projects or opportunities for projects that building owners are providing in their narrative, you never do anything with it. And so this might be one area that the city might want to really take a moment to highlight, or take a moment to say, we may want to put this before the board whenever we're discussing a layer of flexibility with how we go about using the Equitable Emission Fund. So that's my first point. Again, that's about 6B. The next thing that is my first question is about the maps. Is there an expectation that the owner must use these two maps here and when they're sort of fulfilling this requirement? Meaning, are they expected to give you a map? Are they expected to give you the criteria of the map that the building is lining up with? I'm a little bit confused about what is expected by the owner in terms of provide maps, like just a snapshot, so on and so forth.
That's a good question. So all of the maps and criteria that are mentioned are maps that currently exist, either by the state of Massachusetts, the EPA, or the city of Boston directly. Our goal would be to be able to provide owners a platform where all those maps are integrated. And we're currently working with the city to see if that is a feasible thing that we can offer. But yes, it's something that we're working on.
So essentially, it's like you're trying to layer multiple maps from different sources all together. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you. That's helpful. My second question is, and I think this might be related to what you and Claudia and Board Palmer Dunning was referring to, because I have in my files for my own personal notes, the environmental justice populations in Massachusetts. That is another map. And so I guess I'm wondering, should that be included here, or based on what you just stated a second ago, Claudia, maybe it's not worthwhile to include it here since you're actively working to create this layered map, correct?
So the definition of EJ populations we use for BERDO is the same as the state one. So the map we're referring to with EJ criteria is the same as the state. The question is just like, can we put it together with other maps so that it's easier for building owners? And that's something that we are trying to work on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your feedback.
Any other questions or comments on environmental justice reporting requirements? Okay. We'll keep rolling. Again, if something comes up and you all want to come back, we can do that. But let's for the sake of keeping it moving, let's go to the portfolio standard conditions. Dan, you want to just help us do a quick review, and then we can see what kind of comments or questions people have on this.
Sure thing. So for portfolio standard conditions, these are conditions that we envision being standard across approved portfolio. So if you get in a portfolio that is approved by the board, these would be standard conditions kind of attached with that approval. So one, building owners or commit to timely compliance with third-party verification requirements every verification year. Building owners commit to complying with a blended emission standard for their portfolio, unless their portfolio is compliant with an individual compliance schedule, in which case they have like a different situation going on there. If the proposed portfolio has an on-site campus district energy system or combined heat and power plant, industrial manufacturing building, a combination of residential buildings located in both EJ and non-EJ communities, or a mix of deed restricted and non-deed restricted residential buildings, building owners must commit to submitting an emission standard compliance plan 2 years after the board's initial approval, submit an annual progress report to identify any progress made on that compliance plan, and then submit an updated standard compliance plan every verification year. And then the review board or designee may inspect any building that is part of an approved portfolio with at reasonable times with reasonable notice.
Great. Any questions or comments about these or other things we want to see here?
Quick clarification point, the emission standard compliance plan, the details of that have not been decided yet, correct?
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute. So there is some details that were in the proposed policies. And those are in the same folder with where the proposed regulations are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll look for it. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments or questions on these standard conditions?
Yeah, just briefly for number 3, the on-site campus district energy system, that would be like a number of buildings with their own district energy system. That wouldn't be part of MATEP or another company, my company or another.
Yeah, that is correct. So campus district energy system is defined, I think, in adopted regulations, and it refers like buildings connected to the same power plant as you mentioned. So for example, a university that has its own CHP, things like that.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Any last comments or questions on this? And then we got a couple more that we've outlined, and then of course we can add to the list if need be. All right. Let's keep going then. We have obviously this topic, a tenant ability to petition. So I know we had some discussion, and I feel like support from this board on this, but are there other comments on this? This one I think is fairly straightforward, Diane. I don't think we don't have to read it, but if the board, if you have any just additional comments or questions on this, we should, this is the current sort of proposal. I don't think it's changed at all since we last discussed. Okay. Hearing no, oh, Gail, yeah, please. Board Member Lattimore.
I just want to make sure I understand tenant in this use in this case. Because I know in another place in the regulations or ordinance, I can't remember which one it is, tenant, they define, they have the tenant can serve as owner. So is it that tenant that we're referring to here, or are we referring to tenants who are not happy with the way things are going and the way things have been reported, or the way the building's not? Is it the actual tenants, not the tenant as owner? Correct? Okay. So tenants will have the ability to request a termination of a building portfolio.
Yes,
Okay.
this is the broader meaning of tenants. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And when you say the broader meaning of tenants, so this goes beyond residential tenants, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
be any
Thank you.
tenant. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. If no other questions, comments about this, we will go to our last one here that we have, at least on the slides, indicators of inequitable distribution. Board members, do you all want to review, or do you know this one? I feel like it's right here in front of us, but any comments or questions on this one?
I think it's worth reviewing if
Sure, Gail. Yeah.
I can provide a quick review.
Thanks, Dana.
So currently in the proposals, the review board can initiate at its own initiative or via petition from tenants a response to, or to, yeah, to terminate a portfolio if an owner has not prioritized the distribution of benefits to EJ populations. Are there any thoughts or feedback on what these indicators could look like? So some indicators of failure to prioritize distribution may include disproportionate allocation across multiple compliance schedules of compliance of benefits. Sorry, I think there's a typo. Across multiple investments in BERDO compliance and or improvements to buildings located outside of EJ populations, buildings in areas with lower rates of asthma or air toxic respiratory hazard exposure, or urban heat island intensity, residential buildings that are not affordable housing. So just thinking of ways how we can look at portfolios and determine if there's been inequitable distribution of benefits or anything like that.
And to flag
so-
the suggest, sorry, I was just gonna say the suggest measuring allocations of benefits could be looked at as investments in BERDO compliance and improvements, right? There's many ways that we could think about measuring benefits.
So I assume that this means that the review board will have access to kind of measures, EJ benefit measures, meaning, collectively, how are the buildings performing in EJ communities, or how are they benefiting EJ? That's what that, especially if we're going to initiate a petition to terminate or initiate to terminate a portfolio. So it just assumes that there's a body of data that we have access to.
Yes, and that's currently would be based off of the requirement for the owners of the portfolios to submit those annual
Reporting.
reports
Yeah.
and tie it back to what they've said they would be doing. And then the inspection authority if it was needed. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, are there any other comments on this? And then also any other sort of topics that people want to make sure we spend time on? Yeah, Board Member Lattimore?
Yeah, one other thing about, and this is to Board Member Boyd's point about tenants. Have we thought about how tenants get, because I don't know if I've seen like how tenants get information, how they get informed of any of this.
Yep.
Okay.
So we were thinking that it's possible in conditions for a portfolio, the review board could choose to require a certain level of kind of communication or disclosure with tenants of a building. And, that might be based on something the board would want to do, for all portfolios or based on the types of buildings and tenants that they have. But that could be a condition. We'll also, have the city website with reporting, but that will obviously be at kind of a higher level for buildings.
Thank you. I think we should, also consider, and I know this is more labor intensive, but similar to CCAG, well, did I get that right? Community Choice Electric, CCE, how the city has had a campaign working with nonprofits and other local agencies, as well as through the city directly, to get the word out on CCE. Is there a similar process that we could think of here? I know it's easier said than done, but how do tenants get informed of, in addition to the ways you just mentioned of the need,
But I would say that ties in with kind of ongoing thinking about community education and engagement around BERDO. So we'd appreciate thoughts. Yep.
Yeah, Board Member Palmer Dunning.
Yeah, this is a process question that we might getting to later, but in terms of tenants petitioning to terminate a portfolio, would the burden of proof to show that there is an equitable distribution of benefits be on the tenants or the portfolio owner when they come before the review board?
That's a great point, and I think we should think about addressing that, whether it's in the regulations or in the petition form itself. And this is a place where I think we'd want to provide a form for people to utilize, just as we would for many of the applications. So yeah, thank you for that thought.
Okay, excellent. Any other comments on this particular topic, or we did go back a little bit? That's fine. Are there any other comments on the topics we went over, or any other topics that this board wants to make sure we address?
Hi, I had a quick question, Mr. But there is this database for energy and water usage on the boston.gov site, and I think there are 4,800 buildings that were mentioned. And on BERDO's 2022 covered buildings list, I think there are 5,300. So I was curious if it was because they were part of a portfolio or tax parcel, and that's why they were there's a slight discrepancy in numbers, or are they already accounted for under, say, an alternative compliance pathway?
So if it's okay, Chair, I'll answer briefly.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, we don't have our mapping expert on the call at the moment, but I will say, I think part of this may have been that there were some buildings that just their initial reporting evolved to become more sophisticated as we went year from year. So that's probably what it was. We do not yet have any building portfolios or alternative compliance mechanisms. Those will start probably be open for application next year if we get the regulations done by the end of this year.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Okay. If there are no other areas or comments or questions board members want to make on this section, I think we should move to just talking through kind of the next steps here. Are we ready for that? Okay, let's do it. So think Diana, you can help me with this, or yeah?
Yes, I can review next steps. So next steps, as I mentioned, there's a comment period right now that will close this Friday at 12 p.m. So after reviewing the comments received from the formal comment period, the BERDO team will present a summary of the comments and any revised regulations at the August 16th public hearing. So next week, so it's a little bit of a quick turnaround. And these comments will be public after the APCC hearing. And at its discretion, the APCC may open a second formal comment period for 21 days or vote to approve the regs. In terms of the Hardship Compliance Plans and Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, as Claudia mentioned, our goal is to present kind of preliminary regulations of both the fund and hardship at the August 16th public hearing, so next week, for the Air Pollution Control Commission, and those slide decks are also public after the hearing. And we are starting to think about fines and enforcement. I know that we've already touched a little bit on these topics, so those will be a future topic as well for phase 3 regulations. And then this is a visual with a little bit more granularity on how we envision the building portfolios and individual compliance schedules in relation to the APCC and hardship compliance plans and the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund with the APCC as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Diana. Always appreciate the visuals to help break things down. Thank you. All right, so I think we are on to our final agenda item. And so we're gonna just come back to Diana actually just to go through some administrative updates, talk about our next board meeting and what we have coming up, and then we will adjourn.
Great. So yes, administrative updates. Right now, our next tentative schedule BERDO review board meeting is August 21st. If any board members, can't attend, please let me know. Just want to make sure we have quorum for our meeting. And then following that, our next scheduled meeting was September 4th, but that's Labor Day. And I know last time we discussed, or the time before we discussed shifting that meeting to September 11th. So we won't be meeting in 2 weeks. We will be meeting in 3 weeks after our next one. I'm just flagging that for folks. And then I don't know if we, Chair, if we want to discuss this right now, but if we meet on September 11th, we could then meet, because right now the standard would be that we meet on the 18th. So that would put us at 2 meetings kind of back to back. Of course, I don't know if board members would rather have a break before, having 2 Monday meetings back to back. So I don't know if we want to discuss that now or if we can discuss options at the next meeting.
I think if the board is willing, we should just try to resolve it now. We have some time here and I feel like we should use it. So do board members have an opinion about this? So right now, obviously schedule has us meeting on August 21st, then moving our next meeting after that to September 11th. Then there would be an APCC meeting later that week. Is that correct?
Yes, the 13th.
The 13th. And the question is, would we
16th.
want 16th, excuse me. And then would we want to maintain our meeting on the 18th or move it or just have one meeting in September, I guess is the question.
Flexible, so,
I would push for one meeting in September. I have conflicts personally on a couple of Mondays.
Okay.
I would also advocate for one meeting in September. I'm just curious about if we would be falling behind on anything if we only meet once. But I think it sounds like everything is moving at a speed that would allow us to only have one meeting in September.
I would agree with Councilwoman Laura, and what I thought I might have been hearing Diana a little bit differently. It sounded like it could have been an opportunity to, maybe at the last meeting I heard this, so please forgive me. It sounded like there was an opportunity to shift the reoccurring aspects of the meeting. So if we move it to September 11th, then the reoccurrence could all move 1 week down, but I don't know how people have planned out the rest of the year, but I am flexible. Again, worried that, we may start getting applications and with one meeting in September, we may not have to wait until October to begin our process.
Are applications going to be coming in this year? I didn't think that was the case.
I think we probably won't yet because the regulations won't be
Right.
finalized. It's confusing because the regulations reference that September 1st year as the deadline, but we're really envisioning that as next year. Hopefully you'll get applications earlier in 2024, but there shouldn't be any to review in this September. Yeah.
Okay, then I take back my comment. I'm fine with one meeting in September then.
Yeah.
It may be your best chance to do so.
Yeah, let's do one meeting in September, but to board member Ellis's point, if we do decide that it makes sense for us to have our meetings in the same week with the APCC, that would allow us an opportunity to adjust for October accordingly. But I think it makes sense. We'll do September 11th and then take a little bit of a break and then pick it up in October.
And what is that time frame for the APCC? I have a standing board executive committee meeting on Monday. So what is that time frame again that aligns with the ACC? But what Monday is it? First, second, third?
So the APCC.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was making chime in. The APCC meets. I believe it's the second Wednesday or the third Wednesday. So it's the same.
Second or third. Okay.
So if we meet September 11th, that APCC meeting would be, I was right, September 13th. So 2 days later.
So it's the second Wednesday of every month.
I believe so. I believe so. Yes.
Which would, okay. So the next meeting after that would be after the 11th would be October.
If I could interject, I think it makes sense. We could put together a schedule of the APCC meetings and share it with you all, and then we can get feedback if switching the dates makes sense, because I just want to make sure we have those APCC meetings right.
Okay.
That sounds right. It sounds like there's agreement that we do one meeting on September 11th in September, and then we can come back to the change, other adjustments to the schedule. Great. All right, everyone. Thank you for that. I think we unless there's something else, I think we're ready to move on to our meeting adjournment. So is there a motion to adjourn our meeting?
So moved.
Thank you, Board Member Lattimore. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Board Member Ellis. And all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. The motion passes and the meeting is adjourned at 6:14 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Y'all have a great rest of your afternoon or your evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.